Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Dave Chancellor, and I'll be your host today. For today's webinar, we're going to be talking about evictions and housing challenges in the COVID-19 pandemic. But before we lead into our webinar, we think it's important to acknowledge the context that we're in right now with issues of systemic racism, police violence, and white supremacy in our country right now. So in just a moment here, I'm going to switch off the webcams and pull up a statement prepared by IRP Director Catherine Magnuson and IRP Executive Committee member and affiliate Marah A, who of course is our discussant for today's webinar. So we just invite you to kind of take this space and read the statement, and after a bit we'll get back on and carry on with the webinar, okay? Okay. Thank you, and let me just invite our presenters to turn their webcams back on as well, okay? So it's really my honor to introduce our three presenters today. Lavar Edmonds is a research specialist at the Eviction Lab and is about to begin a PhD program at Stanford. April Hartman is a staff attorney at Legal Action of Wisconsin Incorporated, and she's based out of Milwaukee and does a lot of work on issues related to housing. And finally, our discussant today is Professor Marah A, who's a Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor here at UW-Madison in the Sandra Rosenbaum School of Social Work. So thank you all for being here. I also want to thank the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services for their support of this webinar series. That said, any opinions or positions expressed in today's webinar don't necessarily reflect those of ASPE, any other agency of the federal government, or the Institute for Research on Poverty. So we have a lot of people on the webinar today, and of course we hope that it's all going to go off without any sort of technical glitches. But if you have trouble, if you start to have trouble, we do have a technical help box up in the sort of left hand of your screen, and you can check on that. And we are mirroring this call in Zoom, and so you can either dial in the Zoom number on your phone or just completely move over to the Zoom room. Of course, if you go to that Zoom room, you won't be able to participate in Q&A quite so well, but it is providing an option if Adobe Connect's not working for you. So our agenda for today, we have an hour, and in just a moment, I'll turn it over to Lavar, who's going to lead us off for today, followed by April, and then by Marah. And we'll save the final 15 minutes or so for your questions. So we have a Q&A box in the bottom left of your screen. So you can actually type in questions throughout the webinar today, and we'll get to as many of those as we can before our time's up. Finally, we are recording today's webinar, and we'll have that recording posted on IRP's YouTube channel, so you can subscribe there, or we'll also send it out via email if you selected that option during registration. So finally, and we will have a copy of the slides available at the end of the webinar, so we'll have a download link, and you can also check your email for that too. So with that, Lavar, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dave. You can hear me?
Hear you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is Lavar Edmonds, and I am a research specialist with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University and an incoming doctoral student in economics and education at Stanford University. And I'm going to hopefully try, there's a lot to pack into 20 minutes, but I'll try to do a quick overview of evictions throughout the United States, what we've seen in our research, focused on evictions over the last 17, 18 years, or I guess over a 17-year period or so, and talk a little bit about eviction policy across the country and how different policymakers at the local, state, and federal level have been handling, or lack thereof, eviction during the COVID-19 pandemic. So just to start us off so we're all on sort of equal footing in our understanding of where we're coming from here, is housing we've seen for decades has become increasingly unaffordable. That when you look at, say, the 15-year period mentioned here, you can see this clear disconnect where incomes have been relatively flat, especially compared to the increases in rent. Where we've seen across the country, rents have risen roughly 15%. Incomes, again, as I said, have been relatively flat. And so we have this asymmetric issue where people are unable, households are unable to support themselves for rent. We're seeing, even in normal times before this pandemic, over half of renters were rent burdened or spending upwards of 30% of their income on housing alone. Most poor households are severely rent burdened, spending exorbitant amounts of money just on rent. And unsurprisingly, this has fueled a bit of an eviction crisis that we've seen across the country for years now. And so what we've done, the Eviction Lab, is chiefly we were tasked with publishing the first national database of evictions. And so we have, over a 17-year period, over 83 million court records that were cleaned, geocoded, validated, mapped, and made available on our website, evictionlab.org. Of course, our funders there, just so you can see, and I cover myself, that we are funded by several generous organizations. And so essentially what we've been doing is, ideally, trying to make an invisible problem, what we'd say, visible, and highlight just how prevalent eviction is across the country. And so on our website, evictionlab.org, there are a few things I'll sort of quickly go through just to show you the interactive features of the website, and if you haven't been there before, and see the various options, the various possibilities that you're able to use to explore the data across the country and in your area. So one of those, of course, is, as I mentioned, the interactive map, where we map evictions across the country over a 17-year time period, and you can then look up from the state level down to the census block group level, essentially sort of like your neighborhood. You can look at measures of eviction filing rates, eviction rates, and then overlaid as well with several census data, so you can see the poverty rate in this area, the percent of certain different demographics. You can explore all of these things. You also can get the custom data reports, which include a lot of those variables I was just mentioning, and you can download it for pretty much whatever area you're looking for, from the state down to the census block group level, and have that pretty easily available for you for, if you're interested in doing research for this, or just, interested in the area for yourself. You can look these things up pretty easily. We also have a series of rankings features where we were able to essentially combine the eviction data for all these different areas, specifically cities, large cities, mid-sized and smaller cities, and then rank them based off of their eviction rates. And you can see sort of how these places stack up and where the eviction is hitting most severely. And of course, as I mentioned, a really important feature actually of a website, and part of our intent here is being very public-facing and making these data easily accessible to anyone who is interested in this. And so from our website, you can not only view these data, but you can also download these data for yourself and create these customizable reports that you can use for pretty much most other feature you're interested in. Maybe you have to give a presentation on eviction and you need these slides. It's pretty easy to download the different figures and tables and import them pretty much wherever you need to. And so, of course, through all of that, our point was to highlight eviction, and how prevalent eviction is across the country. So this stems from the work of sociologist Matthew Desmond's work, who's the PI for the Eviction Lab. Stems from his work in Milwaukee, highlighting the severity of eviction, of these rental evictions in Milwaukee. But we didn't have a real sense of what it was like across the country. And so being able to collect all these data, we're now able to put some figures to it. And honestly, the numbers are shocking. They're a bit staggering, actually, when you look at it. So just as a general overview, in 2016, for instance, a one-off year, we saw over 3.7 million eviction cases filed in eviction court. And so by comparison, that completely outsizes the number of foreclosures that we saw at the height of the Great Recession over 10 years ago. It's on the order of 2 to 3 times the number. And this is in 2016, a relatively stable, relatively good economic condition. It wasn't spurred on by any particular recession of historic proportions. It was just a one-off year, and we saw a catastrophic number of eviction filings. That should give you a sense of how extensive and prevalent evictions are across the country. The other thing I would like to highlight is just how geographically spread out evictions are. That a lot of times we're talking about affordable housing and the eviction, evictions that stem from that. Most evictions are for non-payment of rent, and so when we're talking about this, oftentimes you'll hear about like New York and Seattle and Los Angeles and these sort of hot spots of exorbitant rent and really expensive housing. And there's certainly an eviction issue in all those places. But one thing that we want to be clear in highlighting is that eviction is not just an urban issue. It's not just an issue in the large cities, not just an issue on the coast. It is everywhere. And you can see here from these figures in 2016 highlighting that very fact that eviction filings and eviction judgments, evictions are pretty common across the country. They're not solely a part of these certain areas, that it is a national issue that commands national attention. Of course, one thing in there that I also want to highlight is that while eviction is geographically diverse and spread out across the country, it does, from our research, and honestly from research of several organizations and researchers across the country, seems to be a recurring theme of eviction having a disparate impact on certain groups more so than others. Chiefly, eviction seems to especially impact Black renter households, that based off of our research on eviction filings over this 5-year period, we observed that Black renters experience eviction rates almost twice as large as those rates for white renters. That result is essentially replicated in Milwaukee, in Richmond, Virginia, in Baltimore, Maryland. It's a recurring phenomenon, unfortunately, of this adverse impact evictions have specifically on Black renters. But if you want to drill down a little more, it's not even, it's to beyond just Black renters. We're also seeing it is especially impactful for Black female renters. We're seeing that in that same study, we're looking at the demographics of eviction. We were seeing in 17 of the 36 states that were included in the study, we saw that Black female renters were filed against at twice the eviction rate of white renters. And this again sort of replicates some of Matt's work in Milwaukee, where he was seeing that Black women made up 9% of the renters in the city, but 30% of the evictions. And then on top of that, renter households with children are especially impacted. We see from eviction that, again, in Milwaukee, we were seeing households with children are more likely to receive an eviction judgment. So again, this is all here just to highlight that while eviction is a prominent issue across the country, it seems to consistently disproportionately impact certain demographic groups. And I think that is an important piece to keep in mind as we're thinking about especially situations like we're in right now, where we have another glaring, crisis, for lack of a better phrase right now, that disproportionately impacts several households or certain households more than others. And so, yes, one thing that I wanted to mention now for a few slides is about evictions during COVID-19. Of course, we are we've been essentially in a precarious, I'll say, economic state for the last 5 or 6 months, and this has unsurprisingly especially impacted renters and has increased, I'll say, the likelihood of millions receiving an eviction judgment. At the local, state, and federal level, there have been different initiatives in place to varying degrees to try to curb that. We have now record high filings for unemployment insurance. Obviously, there is a clear connect where most evictions are for non-payment of rent. We have millions of people going on unemployment. They are unable to make their rent payments on a normal timeline, and so evictions are pretty much all but a certainty. And so several policies at different levels have been put in place to try to address this. They, like I said, have varied considerably by in scope and in magnitude and how long they're actually held for. They're kind of stop-start in a lot of places where you will see I know in my home state of Virginia, where we had an eviction moratorium, and then it expired, and then it was reinstated, and then it was expired again, it was reinstated again. Unfortunately, those times leaving those renters sort of out to dry on their own without much in place to support them. But generally speaking, even with the stop-start nature, we've seen, and I'll show you in a little bit how we've been tracking this, we have seen that they have generally been effective when they're in place. And you look at, for instance, in Milwaukee, we saw that after there was an eviction moratorium in place that was lasted from like essentially March through May, filings were down 99% from the average number of filings we would expect in April. Then the moratorium expired at the end of May, and then filings were up 17% from the average. So not 17% from the previous month, 17% from the average of what we'd expect in a normal Milwaukee in June. There's also, and I'll talk a little bit later about the new one, but there was also the federal moratorium built into the CARES Act, which expired at the end of July. As many of you may be familiar, it didn't cover all renters. It only covered essentially renters and houses with federally backed mortgages and those receiving housing assistance. And so it covered roughly, it's been approximated around half of renters, or a little less than half of, up to less than half of renters. Unfortunately, as I said, that expired at the end of July, and there were certain, I'd say, gaps in there that made it a little trickier to be meaningfully enforced. But for the last month or so, we had been waiting for some other moratorium in place to again try to help these millions of households that are at risk of facing eviction. So as I mentioned, one thing that we've been doing as part of this is tracking a few things in terms of eviction policy. One is on our website, evictionlab.org. You'll see the eviction policy, the housing policy scorecard, where we take each state and we grade them on by a number of criteria to get a sense of how well the state has enacted or not enacted. Several states had no kind of statewide eviction moratorium, but how well they enacted some sort of stoppage or moratorium on evictions. And like I mentioned before, it varied considerably in magnitude and intensity. Some states may have just put a pause on eviction hearings, which is great, except then if you're still allowing filings, and they can pile up, and then when that moratorium ends, as we saw in Milwaukee, then all those filings can unfortunately fester. And so some states, went beyond that, and okay, they've stopped eviction hearings, they've stopped eviction filings, they've also stopped, late fees and utility shutoffs. It's there is a way to do it in such that there is a more holistic approach, and some states went a little beyond that and others didn't. And so you can look on the website to see, and it's updated pretty frequently. You can see how different states are handling it at the state level. There's also the eviction tracking system, where we look at 11, I think as of right now, it's 11 large, mid-sized to large cities, and seeing weekly what their filings look like in those cities. And this is where you can see I've included Milwaukee. You can see, as I mentioned earlier, where there is this sharp decline in eviction filings based off what we would expect in April during the moratorium. And then as soon as the moratorium ends, you see this huge uptick in eviction filings. And so you can see for 11 cities, just sort of get a sense of how different moratoria across the country are playing out. But this is essentially the pattern that we're observing, that as the moratorium is in place, the evictions are gone, or at least considerably diminished, and then the moratorium is lifted, and we see the eviction filings increase again. And so what do those look like, from a monetary standpoint? That now you can imagine, perhaps it's that people are, a recurring theme I've gotten before is, there are renters who are thousands of dollars behind, and then what am I going to do? I have these tenants, and I'm behind on my mortgage payments, and I have all these. And so far, honestly, that's not quite what we're observing in normal times. And I'll show you in just a minute what it might look like now. In normal times, actually, research that we're working on eviction judgment amounts shows that most evictions we're seeing are filed on for roughly 1 to 2 months worth of rent. That, sometimes we're seeing evictions in the thousands of dollars, but that's not always the norm. And maybe surprisingly, that kind of seems to be the trend we're seeing looking at eviction filing amounts during COVID. That we recently, these are preliminary estimates that were just published on our website a few days ago, where we looked at eviction filing amounts in July. This is based off July. Eviction filing amounts, just to get a sense of, okay, well, how much are people being taken to court for? And I don't know, I think this distribution, one, it aligns with sort of what we were saying before, that most evictions are for relatively less money. It's only for, typically 1 to 2 months worth of rent. What we're seeing here is a staggering amount, I think, of relatively small dollar evictions that in both Cincinnati and Houston, and these are actually for the counties that represent them, but these are the anchor cities, we're seeing roughly almost 10% of eviction filings for less than $500. In Phoenix, that proportion is almost up to 20%. You see there are these instances where there are larger dollar amounts, but a significant proportion in all three of these large cities are being evicted for relatively little money. If you want to make a comparison, I mean, this is, in many cases less than the cost of an iPhone, and we're effectively telling these tenants, for the less than the price of iPhone, you should be homeless. We're putting people out of their houses, out of their homes, onto the streets for relatively little amounts of money. And I think that highlights, one, the severity of the crisis, but also how, how much I think intervention could be used here, government intervention to help stop these, to curb these issues and save so many people who are, on the brink of eviction for relatively little. And so, it's always tough. I give a lot of presentations like this. It's tough to ever find some sort of like, and now, happy things, because it's really kind of a dark predicament, and increasingly so for millions of renters, unfortunately. The context we're working in, just to reiterate and close out, in July, almost a third of people in this country reported, survey research, missing a housing payment. Child food insecurity in June was up 450% compared to 2 years ago. We're seeing increases in food banks. So there's this issue of not only are millions unable to make rent, even if you are able to make rent, what kinds of things are we also sacrificing in order to make rent? We often use the phrase rent eats first. Think of what happens for the, unfortunately to mix metaphors there, what else is unable to eat because they're struggling to make rent. I guess if I wanted to end this on some sort of happier, optimistic note, came out recently, as you may have heard, that there is a new federal eviction moratorium in place from the CDC from now through the end of the year that is supposed to cover technically all renter households, so it's a little more comprehensive than the eviction moratorium baked into the CARES Act. Of course, there are some stipulations in there about, income requirements and being able to show hardship, but optimistically, hopefully this is a step in the right direction of making sure that people are covered. Because it's been estimated 30 to 40 million evictions could transpire if we're not vigilant and taking necessary precautions to address this increasingly precarious eviction crisis during this pandemic. And so optimistically, I hope to see to it that this is a step in the right direction and are able to help the millions who are unfortunately not being able to meet the need currently. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lavar. April, can I invite you to start your webcam up, and we're going to turn it over to you in just a moment here, okay?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I am here to talk a little bit about legal action of Wisconsin and eviction defense work. I'm a legal services attorney. I've been an attorney for 13 years working in the housing department at Legal Action of Wisconsin. Legal Action serves the 39 southern Wisconsin counties. We have about 55 staff attorneys and 50 support staff, with offices in 6 cities in Wisconsin: La Crosse, Milwaukee, Oshkosh, Racine, Madison, and Green Bay. I work in the Milwaukee office, so that's the perspective that I am giving. I wanted to thank Lavar for his work at the Eviction Lab, and I wanted to kind of start off where he left off, which was saying that the big news in eviction defense work is, of course, the CDC's federal eviction moratorium that just came out yesterday and should be effective September 4th. We're very excited about that, and I really encourage you, if you work with renters, to find out more about that. Renters have to sign a declaration and give it to their landlord in order to be covered. So it's important, if you're working with renters, that you find out about that declaration and get it to the renters who need it. So Legal Action provides several different housing services. We provide primarily, the #1 housing service that we provide is eviction defense. But we also, through the Community Law Project, which I have started working on, are providing some services of affirmative lawsuits against landlords who fail to make needed repairs. So that's kind of an exciting innovation. We work with people who are denied subsidized housing or a housing voucher. So some of you may be familiar with subsidized housing, where the tenant pays 30% of their income for rent, and then the government pays the rest. And if somebody is denied that kind of housing or a voucher that would help them get into that kind of housing, then we would look at that case, or if they're being terminated. Our volunteer lawyers look at security deposit cases. That's a good opportunity for them to get into court and get a little experience with a relatively simple case. So those are the types of housing services that Legal Action provides. And there's the 39 southern counties. We use different models of service delivery. So when the moratorium was in place, the Wisconsin moratorium that ended May 27th, when that was in place, we were doing primarily phone advice. People were calling us to say things like, my landlord gave me a notice, do I have to move? Or my landlord's not making repairs, what do I do? And we were answering those kinds of questions. Now that the state moratorium is no longer in place, we are dedicating our resources to extended representation, which is what I do. Somebody comes to us through intake, and I investigate the case, develop legal claims, negotiate with the opposing party, and either negotiate a settlement or take it to trial and get a court decision. So that's extended representation. But then we also have a third model of service delivery that we started a few years back. I think that part of the reason that we got funding to start this project was Matt Desmond's book, Evicted. We got the funding through the Legal Services Corporation Innovation Grant, but now it's funded more locally. and it's the Eviction Defense Project Lawyer for a Day. Before COVID, private volunteer attorneys would meet with a client for about an hour before their court date and just try to do what I take longer to do, which is develop their defenses and understand what their goals are. And then they would negotiate with the landlord and either come to a settlement or they would set the case up for trial. And on that trial date, the client would get another lawyer, a different lawyer for the day, who would represent them at the trial, who was willing to volunteer to do that. So it's an interesting model of service delivery. It has enabled us to help many more people. And studies have definitely shown that it is to a tenant's advantage to have a lawyer in their eviction case. And they tend, even though most cases end with a stipulation, with an agreement to dismiss the case, and the tenant either makes a payment plan or agrees to vacate, it's helpful to have a lawyer because those lawyer negotiated stipulations and agreements tend to actually be doable, which means that the tenant will not miss a payment or will not fail to vacate and will succeed with that stipulation. So that's an exciting model of delivery, service delivery that we've started using. I created this slide just to show that most of our clients, the vast majority of our clients, are in the private housing market. They are not in subsidized housing, and this means that although they qualify for our legal services, which is about 200% of the federal poverty level, they do not get any help with paying for housing. And just to show like how rent burdened most of our clients already were before COVID came along. As far as the types of cases that we're seeing during COVID-19, we are seeing mostly non-payment of rent cases. That's no surprise. Unemployment was long in coming to many of our clients, and so we're seeing, we are seeing a lot of cases where people owe, in the thousands of dollars. And what we're doing with those cases is we're mostly working with the clients to help them negotiate the rent assistance program procedures so that they can get the rent assistance they need to stay in their housing. And so, so some rent assistance programs were set up in Milwaukee. Through the state, we got $5.7 million. Then Milwaukee County allocated $7 million, and then the city of Milwaukee allocated $15 million in rent assistance. So rent assistance is there, but it can be a challenge for people to access it. They might not have the technology they need to submit the application. They might not understand the questions that are being asked of them. They might have trouble obtaining the verification. So we do a lot of work helping people negotiate that process and get those applications in so that they can get the rent assistance. Because we're finding that many landlords are willing to work with our tenants, our clients, to keep them in the property because they'd rather have the money than have the eviction. So that's been great. But we are seeing, primarily these non-payment of rent cases. We do also see another kind of case. So during this crisis, a lot of building inspectors have not been going out and issuing orders and making landlords make repairs. And so maybe the tenant just gets sick of the landlord not making the repair, and so they withhold the rent and an eviction follows. Or maybe the tenant does get through to a building inspector and a building inspector issues an order, but the landlord evicts in retaliation for making that call. We definitely see those kinds of cases and represent in those cases. Other reasons for eviction that we see, the gamut. There could be noise violations. There could be somebody is alleged to have committed criminal activity. I've had a recent eviction where somebody was the victim of criminal activity, but they were alleging that it was her guest that engaged in the criminal activity against her, and so they were evicting her for that reason. So we see evictions that just kind of run the gamut. Because of COVID-19, there's been serious changes in eviction procedure. After the moratorium was lifted, courts got Zoom hearings into place pretty quickly, and there's been issues with the Zoom hearings. You know, there are some things that are convenient about Zoom hearings for those of us attorneys who are primarily working at home from home now, but it can be problematic for our clients. They might not get the notice in the mail of the Zoom link of how to get on to the hearing, and that's kind of an interesting issue because we do hear it from our clients that they didn't get the Zoom link and they didn't get the notice. But what we're hearing from the courts is that actually more people are showing up to virtual hearings than we're showing up to in-person hearings. And there could be a lot of reasons for that, but there are fewer default judgments because of these Zoom hearings. We do have some technical concerns. You know, some people don't have the equipment. When the way a Zoom hearing works is that you click the link and you're pulled into a virtual waiting room, and you can be in the virtual waiting room for your eviction hearing for half an hour to an hour before you're pulled into your actual hearing. And of course, some people don't have the minutes or the battery to hang in that long, or some people do hang in and for whatever reason are not pulled into the hearing, and so that is a problem as well. And then we have evidentiary and motion concerns, where what we're talking about there is that people don't know how to get their exhibits, their pictures to the court. And so, you know, in order to opt in as an electronic party in a court case, you have to pay a $20 fee. So that's just not an option for many of our clients and many pro se litigants. And so what they have to do is physically go to the courthouse and mark each of their exhibits and convince the clerk to add their exhibit to the case. And you know, someone just not willing to do that, that can be a really difficult thing to do. But the good news is that the court has been extremely gracious when it comes to, because of these concerns, because they're aware of them, because you know, we're constantly talking with them about them. They've been gracious in terms of adjournments, pushing things out, granting motions to reopen, that kind of thing. So we haven't had a case yet where we've had to raise due process arguments. I know other legal services attorneys in other jurisdictions have, but we just haven't had that case yet. If you are supporting renters, if you're working with renters and trying to help them and they're in trouble, you know, in addition to finding out about the federal CDC moratorium, I would really encourage you to just get them to resources as soon as possible. Particularly rent assistance. Like I said, it takes a long time to get the rent assistance to come through. And so the earlier they apply, most of the programs are first come, first serve. The earlier you apply, the better. Also legal assistance, you know, the sooner we get a case, the more we're able to work it. And so it's really helpful to us if they come to us. Even if they come to us before there's an eviction filed and they just have a termination notice, the tenancy termination notice, that's extremely helpful. If a landlord is not making repairs, you can connect them with the building inspector or rent abatement programs. And rent abatement is when you reduce your rent by a certain amount because the landlord is not making repairs. And you can never, well, it's never a good idea to just try to judge how much you should abate the rent yourself. Although you can, the statute allows it. What's a good idea is to go through a rent abatement program where someone comes out and tells you how much to reduce your rent by. So that's the #1 piece of advice that I would give if you're working with renters and trying to support them, is to connect them with resources as soon as possible. And I just want to thank you again for having me, and this is our contact information.
Thank you so much, April. Yeah, I think that was really helpful, and I look forward to hearing more during Q&A. Marah, do you want to jump in here? And we'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Dave. So thanks so much. My role here is a discussant. So I tried to pull together some themes I thought were important and that we could hold on to and perhaps chat more about in the Q&A. So I'm thinking a little bit about the data that Lavar presented and about frontline workers and about perhaps strategy for how to navigate what is going to be a complex time for those who work with people in rental housing. So just to be really clear about the centrality of housing, we all know this, but I think it really bears repeating. Housing is central to all the other pursuits that we are interested in doing. Housing stability, quality, and affordability are long-standing problems. They're problems before COVID-19, which COVID-19 seriously exacerbates. Disruptions in housing stability are associated with both individual level and societal level harms, and there is a good body of research, both correlational and some causal. COVID-19, as I said, exacerbates long-standing rental affordability challenges and highlights focused attention on evictions. If you think about housing as on a continuum from stably, consistently housed to homeless, there's a lot of dynamic positions between that, and this public health crisis is showing us underlying problems that existed before and are exacerbated by this public health crisis. So when I think about the eviction data, the usefulness, the power of the data allows us to characterize the rate of and geographic distribution of evictions, which is something that was really very difficult to do before because you would have had to go into a locality and pull those records yourself. So when I was listening to Lavar, I was thinking about all the different sorts of questions you could answer by downloading the data, which has a nice public interface. You could understand how large this problem is nationally. You could understand where it may be more pressing. You could understand, you could start to ask yourself questions about why you might be observing geographic differences between cities of similar sizes. Perhaps they have different local level policies. What can be learned across different localities about the severe housing hardship, and what are the impacts across groups? So disproportionate impacts, particularly for Black renter households and Black female renter households, is important within the context of COVID-19 as well, and could be a driver of larger inequities pre-existing COVID-19 and exacerbated by COVID-19. So I'm so glad that both Lavar and April mentioned the moratorium on evictions, which just happened yesterday. So I spent a little time looking at it and thought I would try to distill what I took from this 37-page order and how it might be useful to some of you on the call. So firstly, the CDC order does appear enforceable, right? It's something that they actually have the capacity to do. The order is a lower bound on what localities can do. So what that means, if you have a state, or if you're living in a state or a city where they have had more aggressive or assertive moratoriums, you could keep those, but you have to at least have the lower bounds in the order. It's income tested. It targets those with incomes under $99,001 or joint filers up to $198,000. So what you notice about that is it goes relatively high up into the income distribution. It will hold off the eviction filings into the next year. So put this off until the beginning of next year. The order estimates, and this is from the order, as Lavar also mentioned, 30 to 40 million people in America could be at risk of eviction. So this is considerable, a country of 320 million folks. There are criminal penalties for a violation of this order. I mention this because an order without teeth is not as valuable as one with teeth. So there are teeth associated with this. A fine of no more than $100,000 if there is not a death related to not observing the moratorium, or a year in jail, or both. If the violation results in a death, a fine of no more than $250,000 or a year of jail in both. So I mention that not necessarily because it would go there, but that it means that enforcement should be less problematic, I would argue. So what's the process? As April mentioned, there's a declaration, and it's a form that you have to fill out. So I actually had the ability to look at this form. I don't know if you can see it. It's a one-page form. So I simply say that because that suggests to me that it maybe won't be incredibly onerous to fill out the form. An important thing to note, though, that on this declaration, a renter has to have applied for assistance, right? So you have to have applied for assistance. So that mechanism, April also spoke about that, would be important for those of you who work in housing services. The reason why I mentioned whether or not the process is onerous is because lots of actors across different systems have been asked to do very, very many things in response to COVID-19. So an example would be the unemployment extensions were really kind of difficult for state level UI offices to figure out even how to do. So this seems less onerous. Another thing I thought I would mention in terms of this moratorium is how actors who work in the housing space think about planning. So the moratorium should allow for planning by groups providing legal support like April's Group and others for these upcoming filings after the moratorium. So what it should do is push off the filings until later. Okay? It's important to know that while the moratorium exists, folks are still going to be responsible for their back rent, and they could be responsible for fees and other costs. So how much that will be, how large that will it be 3 or 4 months rent? I'm not sure. But it pushes out the concern about eviction later on. But as I note here, the potential for very large arrears to accumulate is something I think to pay attention to. Now, depending on what happens with the economy and the shape of COVID-19 as a disease transmission public health issue, it's hard to know when we might see some improvements in employment. So I think we're in for a rough ride, but knowing what's, the moratorium is a good thing. And one of the last things I want to mention around the moratorium is that there's no money in this order. So the moratorium does not allow, if you go through the process, for owners of property to evict, but it doesn't ensure that there are any funds for these owners. So what that means, this lack of monetary support for landlords during the moratorium will mean deferred maintenance to those properties, which could have potential long-term health impacts to the stock writ large. And of course, owners of property won't be able to pay their own notes and upkeep their property. I would also point out that it might be particularly difficult for owners of only a few units. So thinking about your owners who might own 1 to 5 units, because if they only have 1 to 5 units, and let's say all of the folks who are renting in those units are unable to pay and are able to get this moratorium, they don't really have other units to spread out the costs over. So I think that's something to pay attention to and to take note of. And then the last thing I would want to, no, I think I have 2 more things to say. Let's go back. One more thing. So when you're thinking about this in your own spaces in the world, however all of you interact with housing, I think it's really important to think about short-term and long-term. So short-term is the crisis. Short-term is figuring out how folks get access to what they have access to, obviously to remain housed. The harms, even without the COVID-19, to being unhoused are significant. And that's the short term. And a lot of gray matter can be used up trying to meet those immediate needs. I would just really hope that there is some space and time for also thinking about the long term while we're reacting to the short term problems. Affordability and evictions are exacerbated by COVID-19. As Lavar started the presentation, this is not new. He showed you data about the increase in rents and the increase in median incomes and the divergence between the two. You could look at other data to support this. HUD has its own data. It has a worst case housing needs it puts out every 2 years. And so there's been an affordability problem for many, many years that pre-exists this. So when organizations and frontline workers are responding to this current crisis, I would love to imagine that there is some planning and strategizing and a maximizing of resources. And I don't just mean monetary resources, I mean information sharing resources. If someone figures out how best to deliver a service, that it is shared. And that there's some time to tie in long-term goals for renters as a class, as a group of people across the nation. Because renter strength and the fairness, the rationalization of the low end of the market increases the ability to navigate it and kind of the fairness of the entire system. So if we can respond to this current crisis, but also illuminate those ties so that we're in a good position when COVID-19 is not what is focusing all of our attention. And the last thing I would say, to all of you out there who are working in organizations and who are working in direct service, thank you for all that you're doing. I have colleagues who are in direct practice and running agencies, and it is incredibly difficult. and it feels like there's a tsunami which you can't respond to, and there's such pressing need. It's important to remember that every day housed is a day that one can remain healthy, observe social distancing, sleep, wash your hands, and do life. People will have children and send their children to school, and they will bury their loved ones, and they will have anniversaries. And all that still happens in the midst of this crisis and this economic downturn. The unrest that we're having, all of this is happening simultaneously. So every day, you are part of helping a family to remain housed, and thinking in the short and long term, you're doing an elegant and graceful thing. All of you are engaged in honorable work for the good of all the communities that you're in and for the greater all of us. And so I want to thank you for the work that you're all doing. Thanks, Dave.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marah. That was wonderful. And especially for going over the CDC guidelines. I know it's kind of short notice to kind of pull that together, so I appreciate you doing so. If I can invite the other presenters to put their webcams back on, we're going to move to Q&A now, and I have a couple of links for you here. And so I want to invite the audience, if you haven't done so already, to feel free to keep on typing questions into the Q&A box. We have a number lined up, but we'll keep trying to get to what we can. So I do have links for the Eviction Lab for Legal Action of Wisconsin, and also slides from today's webinar. So if you click on that, it'll bring you to a link where you can download those. So, but again, thank you to all the presenters. So, but as a first question, I just want to go back to some of April's discussion about resources for renters. You mentioned some of the things that you're doing here in Wisconsin, but I'm wondering if there are national resources that you should point people towards, or particular groups that like ways to find this. How do people find this information?
So an organization that I rely on heavily is called the Housing Justice Network. It's a network of lawyers who are, mostly lawyers I think, maybe other housing advocates who are doing the same kind of work, and they are a really great resource in terms of finding resources and understanding the law, and so I would highly recommend the Housing Justice Network.
Marah and Lavar, I want to invite you also if there are resources that you think are useful that April didn't mention. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Certainly for across the country, I guess tenant outreach if necessary. The Just Shelter website that I guess technically run by Matt Desmond has done a great job of sort of aggregating a bunch of community resources and at the state level or by state. So you can look sort of in your area if necessary if you want to find some sort of like legal aid assistance, something like that.
So we have a question for Lavar to start. Do you have data and see a difference between sort of rates of evictions of subsidized versus non-subsidized renters?
Yes. So I guess sort of similar, close to that, is that we are doing research on evictions in public housing, so public housing authorities as the evictors. And I know that paper is still in the works, I will say, but we're seeing, I believe, comparably high rates of eviction, if not higher in certain areas, for people who are living in public housing assistance, or you know, I guess receiving public housing assistance, and some sort of public housing authority is listed as the landlord or the plaintiff on the case. So yes, I would say it's still very much a prevalent issue in those spaces as well.
So as a next question, and Marah, I think I'll have you take this first. I mean, you mentioned a number of your colleagues who are kind of working in the space supporting folks who either may have faced eviction or just having housing challenges. And you know, what about for people who may have already been evicted, or maybe haven't really been covered by some of the protections that we're seeing? You know, is there any recourse for them? And kind of what guidelines, you know, or what sort of advice do you have for folks that might be in those positions?
Anytime there is an economic downturn that goes a bit higher up into the income distribution, so like a time we're living in now, you're going to get folks who maybe have not experienced economic scarcity experience it. And so then you're thinking about your larger welfare state. So any way that you stabilize income, you stabilize housing. So the first thing that we see, because it's counter-cyclical, are increases in things like SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So any way you get income into a house. So relying on your individual state's kind of Department of Health Services, most things are automated now. You can see what you would be eligible for if you're new to economic scarcity. Again, anything that stabilizes your income, if you are suddenly eligible for SNAP because of unemployment, you're eligible for extended unemployment, all of that is great. Housing assistance is very, very scarce, even with the increases with CARES. Only 1 in 4 eligible families receive it. So it's very important, that slide that April showed about how much of the housing market is subsidized. It's very small. Most low-income renters are in the private housing market. Is that helpful, Dave?
It is. And I do want to invite Lavar and April. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's solid.
Okay.
I would just say that I think that unfortunately people who have been evicted during the period between moratoriums are out of luck and have to reach out to the 211 and social services and the shelter universe, and it's just, I mean, it's really sad that we had this time period between moratoriums, but there's nothing that can be done retroactively that I can think of.
I do have a related question. A couple of people have asked this, but in terms of sort of like expungement of eviction records, you know, I want to think about what things look like in the future for folks. You know, are we going to find ways to give people more grace when it comes to evictions that may have happened during this sort of COVID-19 pandemic time? What do you have to say about that? And Lavar, do you want to start with that question? If you have a thought there.
Sure. I mean, I think ideally moving forward, that is something that is even more on the table. You know, one thing that we want to highlight from our research is it is not just the eviction itself that matters, that having an eviction filing on someone's record can negatively impact their ability to get subsequent housing. And so in these places where, you know, for instance, there was an eviction moratorium in place that had stopped the eviction hearings, you're still allowing those filings, you're still allowing those to compile onto a tenant's record and then sort of limiting their ability to find safe and stable housing down the road. And so, you know, there are places where we've had a conversation about, or they haven't already enacted it, some sort of case sealing, you know, so that their records are not as accessible in the future, especially if they are able to win their case. So I think hopefully this is more of a conversation, because we still have to, even if we have some sort of, you know, stopgap measures and something in place for now, there is the, okay, what comes next? And I think that unless we get a handle on that and are really far, you know, forward thinking in that regard, we're just kind of kicking the can down the road, and we're still going to have, even if we're able to, you know, of course, 4 more months keeping people in their housing is better than nothing at all, but we do need to think about what happens in subsequent years, and so I think it needs to be a huge part of the conversation.
Okay. April or Marah, did you have anything you'd like to add?
The courts will consider motions to seal eviction records if you can make an argument that the eviction never should have been filed. So, I mean, we definitely, everything Lavar said is true, and we definitely need more grace when it comes to considering people's eviction records, but I just wanted people to be aware that that option is out there, and that if people need that service, that's something that they can refer to their local legal services agency for that kind of help.
That's part of the long-term thinking about the nature and structure, particularly of the low end of the rental housing market, is really quite important. So understanding what people are contending with and this concern about eviction records making you less attractive in the future and making you almost a captive audience. And so there are large questions to think about low-income renters as a class.
Okay. So we are essentially out of time for today, unfortunately. So I do want to give each of our presenters to kind of offer a wrap-up thought or something. What do you want to leave us with today? You know, Marah, you were the last to present, so would you be willing to lead us off in that?
Simply how my final slide ended, that there's the current crisis and there was the crisis before COVID-19, and so those structural impediments, particularly at the low end of the market, rational policies, standard leases, expunging records, sharing across cities and states where you have a class of renters who have figured out how to navigate that space. I think those things are incredibly important.
Okay. April, would you like to go next?
Yeah, just with my final slide as well, if you are working with renters, please get them to the legal resources and the rent assistance resources that they need, and please find out about the CDC's federal moratorium.
Thank you. And Lavar.
I think just my recurring spiel of eviction is incredibly prevalent, and it's incredibly tied to all these different facets that I think, you know, sometimes I hear people liken an eviction to like a car repossession. And losing your home, losing your community, it's a destabilizing event that is, I think they're not even remotely similar. You know, Matt makes the point that, you know, poverty is often a cause of eviction, but oftentimes we're finding that eviction is a cause of poverty, that it can push you into an even worse, even more precarious economic state. And so I think that from an economic and social benefit standpoint, we have more than enough incentives to really commit to the funding and support necessary to curb these evictions. But it has to be huge. Time and time again, we're seeing in places, say like in Houston, where it was devoted a $15 million rental assistance program, funds were exhausted in 90 minutes. If we're going to have any chance of trying to combat this issue, we can't be hesitant about it. I think it has to be deliberate and swift and decisive. And I think we have the resources to do it. It just requires the will to act.
Okay. Thank you all so much. I'm just really grateful for the three of you for the work you put into these presentations. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience. We had almost 400 people on today, so there's obviously a lot of interest in this. And I'm just really grateful for all of you taking the time to do this and for the work that you're doing out there. So as we noted before, you can click on that link on the slide to get the slides, the PDF slides for today, and we'll also send out that recording later on. So again, thanks to our presenters and to our audience, and so long now.